Hey, book lovers. Welcome to While I Read. As you can see, I have a very special guest here today, Wilford Brimley. Just kidding. It's actually my daddy, Mark Harris, and he's on the show today because I needed an expert on the Western genre, and he knows more about Westerns than anybody I know. So, Daddy, introduce yourself. Tell everybody about yourself.
Well, actually, the Wilford Brimley remark comes from some things that happened to me for a few years. At least once or twice a year, somebody in a convenience store or a restaurant would come up to me and say, "You look very familiar. You look like that actor. The one with the mustache. I can't think of his name." And I'd say, "You mean Tom Selleck?" And they would say, "Well, maybe, yeah, that's right." But actually, I'm Mark Harris. I'm Katie's daddy, as she said, and I've been reading a long time also. I love to read, started reading when I was very young. I have told people this, and Katie won't believe me, and other people won't believe me, but I really can't remember not being able to read. So, yeah, I enjoy reading too.
Go ahead and tell the story that you tell that I really don't believe.
The one about where you asked me one time when I read Tom Sawyer, and I told her, I thought for a minute, and I said, probably when I was in about third or fourth grade. And she still doesn't believe that, but it's true. I did. I read that book that early.
So, obviously, Daddy is a big reader and has always been since he read Tom Sawyer in the third grade. And so I wanted him to come on today while we talked about Westerns. So, first, I want to give you a little background about why I found myself reading the Western genre recently. I read a book called The Wild Between Us by Amy Hagstrom, which is not a Western. It's about a search and rescue mission to find two young boys who get lost in the high Sierras in California. As I was reading The Wild Between Us, I kept thinking about another book that it reminded me of, and that book was Down the Long Hills by Louis L'Amour. I was thinking about that because that book also features children who are lost. Daddy recommended that book to me when I was a kid, probably about 10 years old, as a good introduction to the Western genre. So I decided to reread Down the Long Hills. I'll talk about it more later, but I'll just go ahead and say on the reread, I loved it just as much as I did when I was a kid. And while I was reading Down the Long Hills, I got COVID. So I ended up having a lot of time to spend lying in bed reading because I didn't feel like doing a whole lot else. So I decided to read another Western after I finished Down the Long Hills. And it was another Louis L'Amour book that I remember liking when I was young called The Cherokee Trail. And I loved that one too. I loved it when I was young and I loved it when I reread it just recently. So I decided that I needed to do an episode about the Western genre. So let's talk about Westerns. So, Daddy, when did you start reading Westerns and what are some of your favorite Westerns?
I started reading Westerns seriously about 50 years ago when I was 25 years old. And of course, I started with Louis L'Amour. My uncle had a Louis L'Amour book, and he gave it to me and told me I should read it, and I did. And I got hooked on them. And I started buying 4 or 5 of them a week and reading 4 or 5 Louis L'Amour books a week for the first month or so. And then I backed off a little bit and decided, I didn't need to be reading quite that much.
They are quick reads. You
They
can
are
finish
quick
them.
reads.
So, for Louis L'Amour, what would you say your favorite Louis L'Amour book is?
Well, pretty much when you read one Louis L'Amour book, you've read all of them. However, I'd have to say probably my favorite is Hondo, which was the story of a big man, a strong man, the strong silent type. He knew where he was going. He knew what he was going to do. He knew what he was going to have to do to get the job done, and he did it.
Which describes pretty much every Louis L'Amour hero.
Pretty much, yeah, that's true. And of course, that was made into a movie. Hondo was made into a movie, and guess who played Hondo in the movie? John Wayne played Hondo in that movie.
Yep, we couldn't do a show about westerns without talking about John Wayne.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Because we both love John Wayne westerns. I also love the book Hondo, by the way. You recommended that to me when I was a teenager, and I enjoyed that book and enjoyed the movie with John Wayne in it, and he was the perfect person to play that role. I think there's a quote from John Wayne where he says Hondo is the best western that he ever read.
He did.
Not referring to the Best Western Motel, the Best Western book.
Right.
So we both love Hondo. My favorite John Wayne Western is El Dorado, which you also introduced me to when I was very young. I think when I was about 8 years old, I think I watched El Dorado every day one summer, and I do have it memorized.
I think it's safe to say that she's seen El Dorado at least 100 times.
Oh,
maybe
yes.
more.
Probably more.
You can quote it line for line.
Yeah. The thing about El Dorado is it's not just a Western about outlaws and gunfighters, although it does have those in it. It also has a lot of physical comedy in it. It's just so funny. In the movie, John Wayne plays a gunfighter named Cole Thornton, and he's helping out his friend who is a sheriff who is an alcoholic, played by Robert Mitchum. And there's also a very young James Caan in it, in what I think was his first movie role, playing the sidekick. And it's just such a funny movie. There's one scene where John Wayne and James Caan are trying to get the alcoholic sheriff they're giving him some kind of hangover cure, and they have to hold him down to do it, and it's just hilarious. So I would definitely recommend watching El Dorado if you want a good introduction to Western movies.
Another good line in that El Dorado movie is when Mitchum sobers up and he gets up and he sees John Wayne and Cole Thornton there, and he says, "What are you doing here?" And John Wayne says, "I'm looking at a tin star with a drunk pin to it."
So what are some of the other John Wayne Westerns that you like?
Well, I liked all of them. There's only one or two that I don't really care for. Speaking of the physical comedy, I can think of a couple more instances. In a movie called The War Wagon, John Wayne and Kirk Douglas were co-stars in it. And there's one scene there when John Wayne and Kirk Douglas are together in a corral or close to where they put their horses up, and these two bad guys come up. And the two bad guys are going to come up and they're going to brace them, as they would say in the movie, but they change their mind and decide to turn around and walk away. But then they turn and they draw on John Wayne and Kirk Douglas, and of course John Wayne and Kirk Douglas both drew first, and they fired and they shot the two bad guys. And Kirk Douglas turns and looks at John Wayne and says, "Mine hit the ground first." But John Wayne said, "Well, mine was taller." And by the way, one of those bad guys that was shot in that scene was played by Bruce Dern, who later killed John Wayne in the movie called The Cowboys, which is another one that you need to see.
Spoiler alert for The Cowboys, because he just told you what happens in it. But yes, The Cowboys is another really good one, but I can't watch that one because John Wayne does die in that movie. There's a scene where he and Bruce Dern have a fist fight, and Bruce Dern says that, he said in an interview that John Wayne nearly beat him to death in that fist fight because John Wayne was drunk while they were doing it. And my thoughts on that are that Bruce Dern deserved it.
Well, John Wayne said he told Bruce Dern when they were filming it, said, "You know what?" He said, "People are going to hate you for this." And Bruce Dern said, "Sure enough," says, "somebody stops me on the street and cusses me out every now and then for killing John Wayne."
And he deserves it. If I ever see him, I'll cuss him out.
Another funny scene was in True Grit when John Wayne, of course, was playing an old drunk in that movie, and they come up to a place out on the plains somewhere, and John Wayne turns his bottle up and falls off his horse, and he looks at his companions and says, "We'll camp here."
Yeah, that's another great one. We could talk about John Wayne Westerns all day long, but let's go ahead and move into the two books that I just read, Down the Long Hills and The Cherokee Trail. So, both of these books are unusual for the Western genre and for Louis L'Amour books because they don't really focus on gunfighters or cowboys. Down the Long Hills is about children, and the Cherokee Trail's protagonist is a woman. But they do focus on timeless Western values, particularly self reliance and courage. Let's talk about Down the Long Hills. Down the Long Hills is about two children, a 7-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl, who have to survive on their own and make their way west to the boy's father after everyone in their wagon train is killed.
Don't forget the horse.
They do have a horse, and that's a big part of it. There's a horse named Big Red, and that was one of my favorite parts of the book when I was a little girl because I always wanted a horse. Somebody would never get me a horse. But I liked reading about horses. And yes, they would never have survived if it weren't for Big Red. And Louis L'Amour sets that up so well. The boy has left the camp to go find his horse, and the little girl follows him. And so they are not in the camp when Indians attack and kill everyone else on their wagon train. So that's how the little boy and the little girl are able to survive. They have their horse, Big Red.
At one point, Big Red fights a grizzly bear and wins.
He does, and it is awesome. So it's a really good book. It's a quick read. It's got great characters, enduring themes of good overcoming evil, spare but beautiful descriptions of the Western landscape. So I enjoyed it just as much this time as I enjoyed it the first time I read it. One thing I kept thinking about as I read it, could a 7-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl really survive on their own for, it was probably about a week that they survived before they got found.
Maybe 2 weeks. It was a pretty good little while, and it does describe the hardships that they suffered and how hard it was for them to survive, especially the little boy, because he knew he was responsible for that little girl. Probably it would have been more realistic, maybe if it had been a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old, but it worked real well the way it was.
And what I kept thinking too was probably children were a little bit, the word that comes to my mind is a little bit hardier at that time. And you know what the boy's name is in the book? Do you remember?
Hardy.
His name is Hardy Collins.
Yeah, Hardy
Isn't that
Collins.
a perfect name for a Western character?
Yep.
Louis L'Amour has some really good names.
Oh, yeah. His bad guy names, I can think of 2 or 3 right off him. One of the bad guys was Shabbit. And you would never think of a good guy being named Shabbit, would you? Who was the bad guy that you were talking about in Down the Long Hills?
In Down the Long Hills, I don't remember his name, but in the Cherokee Trail,
Okay.
the bad guy's name is Scant Luther.
Scant Luther.
Isn't
yeah.
that the perfect name? He's just kind of shiftless, no good. Scant is the perfect name for him.
Yep.
The Cherokee Trail is about a woman named Mary Braden who is hired to manage a stagecoach station on the Cherokee Trail. Actually, when they hire her, they think that they're hiring her husband, but her husband has been killed in the Civil War by guerrilla fighters. And so Mary needs a job. She's a single mother with a daughter, and she needs a job. So she takes the job of managing this station. Her home was destroyed in the Civil War. She has to make a living to support herself and her daughter. So this woman, Mary, is a great character. I read a review on Goodreads from someone named Jesse from 2014, and I just have to read that review because I can't say it any better than Jesse did, whoever Jesse is. So the review said, "She kicks ass and takes names, and it is so awesome to behold." And that's really all you can say about Mary. It's obvious from the beginning that she is smart, capable, competent, and that she is not going to be helpless. In the very first scene, she has to fire the no good man who is running the stagecoach station, Scant Luther.
Can't Luther.
And as I was reading it, I was wondering how Lamore was going to have her do it. Because this guy, is a pretty bad guy. And so I was thinking, well, what is he going to do? And I was afraid that he was going to have one of the male characters step in to help her. And I didn't want that to happen. And it didn't happen. Mary got a horsewhip from one of the other men, and she horsewhipped Scant Luther until he left. So that's how she fired him. She hires an Irish woman named Maddie to help her at the station, and she and Maddie have several conversations about how they may have to defend themselves because Scant Luther may come back. There are other dangers. Running a stagecoach station out in the middle of nowhere is not an easy thing to do. So Mary and Maddie both have guns, and at one point, Mary tells Maddie, "I don't want to frighten you, but keep your pistol where you can reach it." And Maddie says...
That's good advice then or now.
It is very good advice. So Maddie replies, "There was many a time when I wished for a gun, but had none." And you don't want to be in that situation where you wish for a gun, but don't have one. So the women are both willing to stand up and fight if they have to, and they do both have to before the end of the book.
You want me to tell you another one you need to read?
Tell me.
You need to read Ride the River. And it's about a 16-year-old girl who comes down out of the Tennessee mountains to Philadelphia. This would be in about the 1840s, I think. And she's supposed to inherit some money. And she's found that out, and she has to go down and she has to see a lawyer, and the lawyer is a crook, and she just by chance happens up on another lawyer who had known her grandfather and fought with him in the American Revolution. This has got two of the families that we're going to talk about, the Louis Lemieux, the Chantrys and the Sacketts. And here you go with the names. The little girl's name, she's 16 years old. Her name is Echo Sackett. And she's tough, she's very capable, she carries a gun, she carries a knife, and she knows how to use them. And she gets the money and gets back home against all odds. But that's one you need to read, and you would enjoy too.
Yes, I love these female characters who are not helpless. They know how to use guns, they know how to defend themselves, and they are going to if they have to.
Right.
So getting back to the Cherokee Trail, we had a little segue there, which often happens when we're talking about Westerns or about anything with Daddy. So Mary's character development in the Cherokee Trail is great. She's described as being homesick sometimes for her past. She lived in a beautiful plantation house. She had a life of luxury and ease. And so she is homesick for that. But then she puts it out of her mind and just goes on doing what she has to do to make a living for herself and her daughter. As the book continues, she creates an unlikely family with the people who are working at the stagecoach station with her. She recognizes that her work is useful and even enjoyable. And there's also a hint of romance with a mysterious drifter / gunfighter named Temple Boone.
Big and tall, no doubt, and
Of
very
course.
capable.
Of course, yes. And somebody on Goodreads, I think it was the same person, Jesse, pointed out that you might expect Temple Boone to be a main character in a Louis L'Amour book. But he is very much a secondary character in this book. He's not even as major a character as Maddie is. Mary is the main character who runs the stagecoach station. Maddie is the woman she hires to work with her. Temple Boone is there and he's helpful sometimes, and he's a great character, but he's not the main character in this book. So both Down the Long Hills and the Cherokee Trail are great Westerns with somewhat unusual main characters. And I loved both of them. If you've never read a Western, they might be good starting points for you, as they were for me so many years ago. And so, Daddy, I want you to talk a little more about some other Louis L'Amour books that you might recommend.
As I said a while ago, if you've read one of them, for the most part, you've read all of them. There are some outliers like the two she's described here that have the female lead characters in them, but most of them have got the big, tall guy who's very capable. There are a couple of the books written, I won't say currently, but in from a 20th century perspective, and one that would be a good one to start on is called Last of the Breed. And it's been 30 years since I read it.
And by 30 years ago, he probably means 1975.
Probably so. Anyhow, it's about I think he was a full-blooded Sioux Indian, but he was in the American Air Force, and he was flying an experimental jet. And he crashed somewhere up near the Bering Strait and was captured by the communists. And Last of the Breed comes in when he makes a statement in his mind. He said they don't know who they're dealing with. And it's the story of how he got away from the communists, from the Russians. And then he went back and exacted revenge on the guy who had mistreated him so bad. So yeah, that one's a little bit different. It's set in current times. Most of Louis L'Amour's stories are probably set anywhere between 1855 and 1890. This is a pretty good example right here. This book, the name of it is Fallon, and no, it's not about a late night.
Not about the guy who used to be on Saturday Night Live.
and here we go again with the names. His name is Macon Fallon. Where that came in, I don't know. But as I said, he was a no-account gambler who turned out to have a heart of gold and helped everybody and got the girl and married her in the end. Most of his books, not most of them, but many of his books deal with a family, the Sackett family, Sackett. And let me tell you what, those Sacketts are some bad dudes. The very first Sackett book he wrote, not chronologically, but he started with this book and then he went back and picked up chronologically earlier. But the name of it was The Daybreakers, and it was about three brothers who came down from Tennessee and joined up with a cattle drive, and they wound up, two of them actually as gunfighters. I said that wrong. This has just got two of the brothers in it. It's Orrin Sackett and Tyrell Sackett. And Orrin turns out to be a lawyer, and Tyrell turns out to be a gunfighter. But it's the story of them developing their characters and how they came to be Westerners and the things that they went through. That Sackett family is probably in at least a dozen of his books. There were flatland Sacketts, there were highland Sacketts, and there was a group called Clinch Mountain Sacketts, and they were the real bad guys. They were almost semi-outlaws. So his book, and here we go with the names again. One of the older brother of Orrin and Tyrell Sackett, his name was William Tell Sackett, and they called him Tell Sackett.
Your lookalike, Tom Cruise. I mean, not Tom Cruise.
No.
Your lookalike, Tom Selleck, played one of the Sackett brothers. Which one did he play?
I think he played Orrin, and I think Sam Elliott played Tell Sackett. Tell Sackett was sort of a tragic character. Bad things were always happening to him. Most of the books that he's in, he's not with any of his brothers or he's not with any of the other Sacketts. But in one particular book, his wife is actually murdered. And he's shot and wounded very bad. And it turns out that he tries to go back to avenge his wife's murder, and he gets surrounded by about 30 or 40 men from this outlaw cattle ranch bunch. And there's one line in the book where a bunch of his cousins and brothers are coming to help him. And I mean, this Sackett's coming from all over the place, and one of the lines in it that's a little bit humorous is somebody said, you know what, it says there's 40 men have got Tell Sackett surrounded up on the Mogollon Rim. And one of his cousins said, Tell wouldn't be so cantankerous to kill all 40 of them before we got there, would he? So they follow that Sackett family, and those Sacketts watch out for each other. You know, they're all tall, they're strong, they're good gunfighters, and most of the time they end up with a girl, except poor Tell Sackett goes through 2 or 3 different books where he's disappointed in his love life. And one of the things I read said that Lemure was writing a book about the time he died about Tell Sackett finally finding the love of his life, but he died before he could finish the book.
Poor old Tell.
Poor old Tell. Other families in that group were the Chantrys and the Talons. Talon, that was the name they took. They came over from France and they took the name Talon. Let me tell you what's going to happen now. There's going to be a bad storm in just about every book that he writes.
Yep, and down the long hills, there was a snowstorm. In the Cherokee Trail, it was a big thunderstorm.
Big thunderstorm. In this particular book right here, it was a thunderstorm where Fallon was going down into this valley where this young man was supposed to be holding a horse herd, and he had got drunk and left. And there had been a big thunderstorm, and they were all going to drown when the water got there, and Fallon had to go in and save them. So, he literally hung on to a tree limb till the floodwaters went down. Another thing that's going to happen in those books is there's going to be gunfights. There's going to be several gunfights. And the Sacketts are always going to come out on the winning end of the gunfight. Another thing that's going to happen is that there's going to be a bad fist fight. And I'm going to refer to that here a little bit later on with...
There's not a fist fight in Down the Long Hills. I think the fight with the bear kind of takes the place of the fist fight.
The fight with the bear, and also the little boy gets beat up
he does. He gets beat up by the bad guys. So I guess that counts as the fist fight.
So these are things, this is what you call a formulaic Western. I mean, he's got a formula. There's the good guy, there's the bad guys, there's the girl, there's usually the horse. The horse.
The horse is very important.
In lots of them. So these are things that you can expect in the Louis L'Amour books. I'm going to wind my part of this up by reading a couple of, there's my glasses right there, by reading a couple of little blurbs written by critics here. This guy, I forgot what his name was, I think it was Stuka or something like that. He said, I have no argument that L'Amour's total sales have probably surpassed every other author of Western fiction in the history of the genre. Indeed, at the time of his death, his sales had topped 200 million. What I would question is the degree and extent of his effect upon the American imagination. His Western fiction is strictly formulaic and frequently, although not always, features the ranch romance plot where the hero and the heroine are to marry at the end once the villains have been defeated. Not only is there nothing really new in the basic structure of his stories, even L'Amour's social Darwinism, which came to characterize his later fiction, was scarcely original and was never dramatized in other media the way it was in works based on Zane Grey's fiction. And by the way,
we don't like that guy.
No, we don't like that guy too
Not
much.
Zane Grey, the guy who wrote this.
But this one, to me, describes the Louis L'Amour books and how good they are better than anybody could. In 1976, Charlie Daniels Band put out an album called High Lonesome. And High Lonesome was the name of one of Louis L'Amour's books. I could tell you about it, but if you've read one, you've read them all. And this is what Charlie Daniels wrote in 1976 to Louis L'Amour. By the way, he refers to James Bama here. James Bama was the artist who did lots of the artwork on the covers of the Louis L'Amour paperback novels. Here's what Charlie Daniels said to Louis L'Amour and James Bama. Here's to gut-riding whiskey and Saturday night, and pistols and poker and hellacious fights. Here's to cowboys and trappers and mountains and woods, and slim with a saddle and rose plenty good. Here's to hard-living men who took care of their own, like Chantry and Sackett, Catlow and Kilroan. From the lowlands of Texas to high Tennessee, what a hell of a fine place this world used to be. my sincere appreciation for the hours of honest pleasure you've both given me. Charlie Daniels, 1976.
Well, we couldn't say it any better than Charlie Daniels. So, Daddy, I want to thank you for joining me for While I Read today. This has been the most fun episode that I've gotten to film this whole time, and you'll have to come back on as a guest later. You've said you might come on when I talk about some W.E.B. Griffin or Tom
Yeah.
Clancy books.
Yep.
So, thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed today's show, please like and subscribe. Please also comment about some of your favorite Westerns to read.
And now, you go clean your gun while I read.